this week, we're going to be talking about the body of a news story. Now, last week we were talking about leads and headlines, and this week we're going to focus on putting all the details together and coming up with a full news story, a feature story or a hard news story. Now, I know it may seem like that we are going out of order in putting this story together, but it'll all make sense as you start doing your own feature story for your final project and doing some more exercises and lab assignments. It'll all make sense. There's a method to this madness. Now, let's get into the body of a news story. I love this pictograph because it subsequently explains how the pieces come together when we're talking about a news story. So, last week we talked about the lead. What's the lead, Chris? In the story. It's the central idea. So we sum the lead up in 1 to 2 sentences, and that's our first paragraph, about what the main idea and the central point of this story is, what the action is in this story. And then, as you can see, paragraphs in 2 and 3 serve as our nut graphs. And then it moves on to more deeper and explanatory paragraphs that we fill with research, that we fill with anecdotes, quotes, sources that give credence and verify all the things that we have pointed out in our lead sentence. Now, what you see here also are transitions. What are the transitions on this train? They're linking the trains together. They're linking the paragraphs together. And I love this pictograph because it does a good job of showing you how important transitions are, how important the paragraphs are, where they fit in a body of a story, the lead, how all of these things come together. The transitions hold the paragraphs, and in this case, the cars or the carts of the train together. And then the railroad is basically your who, what, where, when, why, and how that you're going to be answering as you build this story along. So it's serving as your trail. The lead is leading the story. The paragraphs are filling it in behind. And then you have your who, what, when, where, and why that you are filling in as you progress throughout the story. You're giving more details and you're expounding more on the who, what, when, where, why, and how in the story, and you use transitions to make it all happen. So we're going to break some of that down today. Now, I know we talked about the inverted pyramid, but let's revisit it. The inverted pyramid, as we've already talked about, is a formal convention that journalists use to write a basic news story, especially a basic hard news story. And why do we write in the inverted pyramid style? Why would we flip the pyramid upside down? Because we filled the top of the pyramid with the most important and critical information about a story. And then the subsequent paragraphs are used to provide more details. And at the end, because when you flip an inverted pyramid upside down, at the end there's a very small space. And that's for additional information that's not necessarily critical to the story, but it's still relevant. So it helps an editor and readers decide what's most important. It helps them decide the who, what, when, where, and why, and how it should progress throughout the story. It ensures that all the facts are immediately understandable and accessible to the reader. And it allows the editor to shorten information. If I need to cut a news story, where can I start cutting if I invert the pyramid? At the bottom. Because we move paragraphs and stories from one main idea to the next, we've already talked about last week how paragraphs in media writing are short. They may be 2 sentences, they may be 1 sentence, they may be 4, but we move from one main idea to the next. Thus, by using the inverted pyramid style, we can start cutting from the bottom, and the main idea and the focus of that story is still intact. That's why you're able to click on a news article and read the first paragraph and the headline, and you pretty much know what the story is about. Now, you have to decide whether you want to dig in deeper or not, but you have the gist of the story upon arriving to the site. So, the additional paragraphs that you're going to add, they add descriptors, quotation. They bring out the conflicts, the varying viewpoints on both sides of an argument, explanations, background information. All of your meat and potatoes go in the nut graph and additional paragraphs. That's where you start explaining what you're talking about. But there are some disadvantages. We've already talked about it. And that's why we went over alternative leads. We can fall into this trap of writing the story the same way. And because the inverted pyramid style is primarily used for hard and critical news, it rarely contains surprises. We're not trying to surprise readers when we're talking about a war. We're not trying to surprise readers when we're talking about an economic disaster or a 6.5 million bill deficit or anything of that nature that's critical and important to the reader. We don't want to surprise you. We want to give you the information that's relevant to you. Thus, the inverted pyramid style might not work for every type of story, but it does work for hard news stories. And there's something else that a lot of people don't know. People with less than a high school education may not understand this format. It may confuse them, but because we've been in the media environment for so long, we understand a news story when we see it. We understand that when we see 43 after a person's name, that stands for their age. So you have to be acclimated to this type of writing style to understand it. Thus, that's why we follow a formula. So readers and audiences and the mass, people in the world, can have a uniform way of reading stories. Now let's talk about organizing information. We just talked about the lead contains the most important information. Think about an accident. What do reporters emphasize in all news stories? We talked about this last week. I told you if you remember nothing else, you should remember the inverted pyramid, the 5 W's and H, and what does every news story contain? People and what happened to them. They are going to be central to every single story. Now, whether we name the person in the beginning or the headline depends on if they are a prominent figure in society. Otherwise, we are generally interested in stories about people and what happened to them. So, first things first, what is the first thing we're going to report about in a story involving an accident?
How many people were involved?
Yes, and if they were injured. 5 people were involved, none were injured. Off the bat, that alleviates my stress, right? We want to know those things. What would the subsequent paragraphs talk about? Describe the accident itself. Now you're getting into the meat and potatoes, the what, the why, the how, all of those things. You see how we're moving along the who, what, when, where, why, and how? We answer immediately at the beginning who and what happened to them, and maybe when. But we get into the what and the how. Now, we add quotations in paragraphs 5, 6, and 7. No specific order, but to add color and give personality to the people who've been involved in this accident. We might also include some creditable sources from a police officer, a fighter who was on the scene. These are the quotes that you use to verify the story that you are reporting. And then finally, is damage to the car going to be significant? No. It's not. And you see sometimes people do that all the time. Why do we care that their car was totally smashed? That's not relevant until it is. If their car is smashed and it's this unusual thing, we might mention it, but if we do, where would we mention it? At the end, because this is additional information, and I have 600 words, and I only use 400 to tell this story, so I can add in those minor details. It's still relevant to the story, but not a critical piece of the story. So let's look at it. We're going to summarize the story, identify those who are injured, explain how the accident happened, report charges filed. Were there any charges filed? Quotes. Unusual, damaged traffic, minor details. And each of those paragraphs may be 2 to 3 sentences. One of them might be one. But at the beginning, you see that we didn't identify the people until the second paragraph. That's because if it wasn't President Trump or President Barack Obama or First Lady Michelle Obama or Kanye, or remember the stories about Kobe Bryant and his daughter, we open up the stories with those people because they were prominent people in our society, right? These are people who are either public figures or people who govern the decisions about our lives. Thus, We don't open up with people's names unless they are relevant that way. Now let's look at more organizing the information. The way you organize a story will be based upon the nuts and bolts of that story, how unusual it is or how unique it is. Every story won't be approached, every accident story that you write won't be approached the same way, right? But as long as you have an understanding of what you need to emphasize and what's most important, you'll be headed in the right direction. So you always want to think about those newsworthy elements. And what makes a story newsworthy? Timeliness, prominence, proximity, impact, magnitude, unusualness. And so you have to weigh those things as you move throughout the story. The subsequent paragraphs after your lead and nut graph should give details to support. It should always support. Why don't we end stories with a summary? News stories. Right, because we do the inverted pyramid. That would not work. Readers don't want to wait around to see what the end result. Right, we came to this news story immediately looking for the action. And as I tell my students about the news characteristics of a story, you have an action, conflict, central character, setting. All those things applied to you in elementary, and they still apply today when you're writing a news story. We just flip it over. We don't summarize at the end. We summarize at the beginning. So we're flipping the inverted pyramid upside down. Let's look at this example. A Hattiesburg man was in serious but stable condition yesterday, a day after he fell asleep at the wheel and collided with a box truck in South County. David A. Carlton Jr., 19, was driving a 1998 Ford Explorer East on Route 258 near Brookswood Road just before 3 p.m. when he fell asleep and crossed the center line, county police said. The Ford collided with a westbound GMC box truck, which overturned, trapping Carlton. A county fire department spokesperson said it took 15 to 20 minutes for firefighters to free Carlton, who was flown by state helicopter to the Maryland Shock and Trauma Center in Baltimore. The box truck driver, 29-year-old Mike Cox of Waldorf, and passenger Ralph Turner, 26, of Fort Washington, were not seriously injured. How do you all feel about this story? It's long, okay. Agreed, it's kind of long. It waited a little while to get to the point, but the first paragraph does what? It tells us that it gets to the point, right? But there's something that's misplaced here. The last paragraph. He was also in this wreck, right? We need to move it up. I would actually make him the second paragraph because remember, we stay from one main idea to the X. Or you can say a Hattiesburg man was in serious but stable condition just after he fell asleep at the wheel and collided with a box truck in South Carolina. The second paragraph, the passenger of the box truck was not seriously injured. You get where I'm going? Go ahead and mention the people and what happened to them. Also, do you see a county fire spokesperson? How does that stick out to you? When reading that little clause, how does that stick out to you? What does that say to you? It's a creditable source. You trust it, right? And you have to think about those things. So when you're telling the details of a story, always tell your readers, where did you get it from? Were you on the scene? Did you get this report from a police officer? Did you get this report from a health official? We are going to want to know those things. But something else. What did we say about using brand names in news stories? Not to, because that's free advertisement. Also, it's getting bogged down, right, with GMC, Ford pickup. Just say truck and move along. The brand or the type of truck does not matter. We have a Ford Explorer, a GMC box truck. It's getting in the way. As Chris was saying, we are stuffing too much in the story, and those are those extra and additive details that are not necessary. And
in news stories, they say 18-wheeler collided with a sports car.
A sports car, right? Because if we are saying that it was a Ferrari, who are we advertising? Ferraris, and you have to be careful about that. Because Ferrari isn't paying us to tell their stories. You get what I'm saying? So you don't want to include brand names. Just say a truck, a four body cab, or something. But don't start getting into GMCs and Fords, because that doesn't have any relevance to the story. So the nut graph, it's the second paragraph. And it's just as important as the first paragraph. So the first paragraph summarizes the main and central point of the story. But what does the nut graph do? If it comes right after, it immediately put the story into context. What were you about to say?
I was saying like you should basically how you elaborate more on the story.
Boom.
Yeah.
Details. It should immediately tell me who is the man. Okay, you say he was in a car crash. Tell me about the details of the car crash, right? Go ahead and put everything that you mentioned in the first paragraph, start putting it into context. It should emphasize the news and provide a logical transition. We should always know where you're going in a news story. It contextualizes, it explains, it makes the people understand who was involved, how the accident happened. And you don't jam all of that either into the second paragraph, but you start there and you move on down with the subsequent paragraphs. Now let's look at some things you should avoid. And this is filled with examples. Leapfrogging. And this is a major thing, one of the main things that people do in news stories that confuses reader. It's a failure to signify the individual that you reference in the first paragraph. Read this for me, Justin. Mm-hmm.
The man ran his car into his wife's car, then shot her in the arm and leg before bystanders tackled him, police said. Police expressed gratitude to the bystanders who helped bring
Felipe.
Felipe M. Santos, 53 of Allenwood, into custody Monday.
Who rammed their car into their wife's car? Who was he? The bystander, or was he the man who rammed his car? You get where I'm going? You need to be more specific. Reading this, I don't know if Felipe is the man who rammed his car into the back of his wife's car, or he was the bystander who was telling the police about this incident. So you need to clarify and say, police expressed gratitude to the bystanders who helped bring the man suspected of the attack. You get where I'm going? Identify these people, because otherwise we don't know who you're talking about. And you can expect your readers to understand if you don't. But sometimes we are so close to a story, we don't even see our errors. That's why editors and people in a news media environment, you passing your stories along helps you point out the errors. What was your question?
So like, if you see somebody, if I see somebody shoot 10 people, or we have witnesses saying this person shot 10 people, and he's been tried on shooting 10 people, do I still say, like, 'cause here it says suspected of, but it said the bystander saw him do it. So like, you still have to say suspected or alleged.
What are you asking?
Like you said, help bring the man suspected of the attack.
Yes,
But they saw him attack him.
that's true. He probably hasn't been tried yet. And you don't want to, that's a good
That's what I'm
question.
asking, like, if they hadn't been found guilty, do you say like?
Yes, suspected of attack, because the trial probably hadn't happened yet. And at the end of the day, whose word is it going to be against? Their words are going to be pitted against each other. The man who saw him and the man who's probably going to say, you didn't see me, right? Felipe is probably going to say, I didn't do that, right? So until this case is tried in front of a jury and a judge, you have to say the man suspected. That was a good question. The man suspected of the attack, unless it's proven, unless you got this report from a police officer that said otherwise. Good question. Switching topics. Sometimes people forget how transitions are supposed to work, why they are essential. Because if you don't, it'll seem like you are just jumping around from paragraphs to the next. Because remember, we go from one main idea to the next. So in order to do that, though, what is essential? A proper transition. Listen at this example. The mayor and city council agreed Monday night to freeze wages and make city workers pay more for benefits in an effort to close a budget deficit that is now larger than officials expected. Mayor Sabrina Richard, who has been a lifelong resident of the city, is in her fourth term as a mayor. She has seen many ups and downs over her years as a mayor, but hopes the city can overcome its problem. What is the first paragraph talking about?
How they, what they gonna do, like,
Close this budget deficit. What is the second paragraph talking about? What do we want to hear more about? Yes, why are you telling me about the mayor? And that could come very extremely last. Check out this second paragraph. Mayor Sabrina Richards said the wage freeze and other measures are needed to prevent layoffs of city employees, cuts in programs, and more drastic physical whatever. This is giving details as to why they want to freeze the wages. The paragraph about Sabrina Richards as a mayor and how she feels can come at the very end, literally, because it's just like, okay, she cares, right? But right now, we want to know why she's insisting that we need to freeze wages. And that's a nut graph. Dull names. Sometimes we get caught up in emphasizing people's names and their titles, and that really doesn't have any credence to what the story is about. Their titles aren't necessarily relevant to what happened to them, unless it is. You get what I'm saying? And you'll know when you should be naming them. But look at this example. A highway engineer was killed Wednesday at an Interstate 95 construction site when a tractor trailer owned by Shearston Trucking and Company plowed through a concrete barrier and struck him. A material engineer, Riley Patterson of Independent Testing Laboratory Incorporated, was killed in the mishap. Jonathan Martin, a site manager for Baldwin Construction Company, saw the accident happen. Like, you don't even know what really happened in this story because we've read like 5 titles, right? That gets in the way. It gets in the way of actually telling the story, actually talking about what happened to these people. Check this out. A tractor trailer plowed through a concrete barrier at an Interstate 95 construction site Monday, killing a highway engineer. The force of the crash pushed the concrete barrier into a piece of road equipment, crushing the engineer Riley Patterson. Patterson had been using a core drilling machine to bore a sample hole in the concrete road bed when the accident occurred. He was pronounced dead on the scene. It's a lot more subsequent, and now we literally get details of how this man died. Instead of going through everybody's titles, trying to show how they were related to this accident. You can use more general terms like the engineer. Or, yes, the engineer, because all of them were engineers. It didn't matter if he was a tractor trailer engineer or a roadside engineer. They were all engineers. So use general terms instead. Don't get caught up in those type of things. Then finally, avoid too much too soon. Sometimes we can get so caught up in putting all of the important information in the lead, right, that we put too much in the lead, that it gets confusing. Look at this example. Local Red Cross officials expressed alarm Wednesday that blood supplies are dangerously low prior to the beginning of the long holiday weekend. Nancy Cross, executive director of the Broadway County chapter of the American Red Cross, said the Red Cross strives to maintain an adequate blood supply for emergency situations. The role of the Red Cross since it was founded is to help people during time of need, she said. What's happening in this paragraph? Both of these paragraphs. We talked about the fact that they expressed alarm Wednesday, right? But in the second paragraph, we talk about Nancy Red Cross' role for the Red Cross and why the Red Cross was founded. That's too much in one paragraph. That nut graph paragraph is doing too much. It's not even addressing what the lead is about. What is this lead sentence about? We need more blood. So how does anything expressed in that second paragraph give credence to that? See, we can get lost in trying to put so much detail at the top. It has no relevance. Check this out. Restocking those supplies will require 50% increase in blood donations over the next 3 days, said Nancy Cross, executive director of the Forest County chapter of the American Red Cross. Now I'm giving details about how Nancy is talking about how critical it is and how much we need to re-up supplies for blood emergency situations. Now let's talk about ending a story. Those are some things you need to avoid. And as you start working on this, you'll start thinking more about how you write a story. It forces you to think about the pieces of a story, transitions, how you want a story to progress, because how you decide for a story to progress will determine how people interpret it. So writing is really a critical thinking and a structured process that you have to take one step at a time. But when we get to the ending of a news story, why is it important? We know we put less significant details at the end of a story, but it can also do other things. And why is that important? It can be used to reiterate the central point. For example, go back to this example right here. Sabrina, right? This last paragraph. You remember I said that this paragraph could go at the very end. And we could use this paragraph as the second paragraph, right? This paragraph could go at the end because it reiterates how Sabrina wants to address the problem. Why she's so committed to fixing this problem, especially that last sentence. She has seen many ups and downs over her years as mayor, but hopes the city can overcome its problem. That's one of the problems. And in a way, we are still pointing toward that issue, but also incorporating Sabrina at the end. You get where I'm going? The ending paragraph still has to do a job, even though it can get cut. So don't think that you can just throw anything in the last paragraph. You can either choose for it to be impactful with a quote, right? Or you can end with a story, describing a scene, focus on details like statistics. You can still do stuff at the ending that's not as central to the main things that you were reiterating at the top, but still holds some credence to the story. So don't forget about the ending is basically what I'm saying. Now let's talk about complex stories. What would make a story complex?
You said complex, like in hard to understand, or
Yes, a story that's hard to understand and digest.
like
It can have,
not enough detail, like you can't really follow what's going on.
okay, but what would make, okay, that would make it complex, but also if we're talking about a lot of different things, right? That would make a story complex before we even start writing it. Like I have to explain a lot of stuff before I can even tell you the story. I have to explain all of these parts. So if there's a lot of things that I have to address about the topic, that could also make it complex. If we're talking about fracking, I can't assume that the average American or the average citizen in a society would know what fracking is. So I got to break that down. So this is what can make a story complex. So what you want to do is what we've been saying this whole time. You want to lead with one or two important actions. And typically, you got to prioritize what's most important. So this is going to cause you to make some judgment based on the news values that we've talked about what's most important in the story. And then you summarize the main points in the second and third paragraph. So you're really just working your way down. After you summarize the major points, the central points of this story, use the next paragraphs to discuss them in more details. The city council voted on blah, blah, blah. In the second paragraph, they also voted on blah, blah, blah. When I get to the third and fourth paragraphs, now I'm going to discuss their decisions about that. You get where I'm going? So you're working back. You're just building more and you're working back. You mention all the cases up front to signal your reader about what's to come in this story, and then in the subsequent paragraphs, you give the details that you need. So technically, your nut graph would probably come in paragraph like 5 or 6 because you have so much to explain in the beginning. But you don't want to try to cram all of that into one paragraph, the lead, and you can't do that. So it lets the reader basically know what will be discussed later, and you'll be able to point back to things that the readers can infer on. Readers get confused as the lead and following paragraphs mention only the most important paragraph because they may stop reading. They may stop reading right there. So you need to signal to them that there's more to come. So we sometimes use lists to do this. You've seen this on CNN. Fox does it sometimes. When we have a lot of stuff to talk about, lists can really be a concise and short way for the reader to sum up main points. Look at this example. The governor said he wants to raise the state sales tax to increase state spending on education. He told the National Education Association he would use the money to do all of these things. Could you have said all those things in one sentence? No, that's a lot to talk about. So he broke it up in a small list to make it more readable and more understandable to the audience. All right. Now let's get into some different writing styles. There are several ways that we can construct the body of a news story. The hourglass style involves 3 main parts: the inverted pyramid at the top, a pivot or a turn, and a narrative. When would we use this type of structure for a story? If I had a pivot and a turn and a narrative at the end, what kind of stories would this work good for? Entertainment, because there's some pivot, there's some turn, some exciting turn, or maybe an unexpected turn that the reader wasn't aware of in the beginning. So it works good for political campaigns. It allows the power of the story to develop details. And the pivot becomes the most important transition that you're going to use because it switches from talking about the main points of this story to going into a narrative that expounds on a personal experience. You get where I'm going? So we're using the pivot and the turn to make it more personal. Then we have a focus style. I love this style because this is the example that I used for last week in the lead paragraph about the woman who was getting ready to vote about the annexation that was happening in her city, right? So we start with a small anecdote. We focus on one specific situation, person, or instance, and then we generalize it to the larger audience. So I might talk about how Caroline feels about the upcoming election and her frustrations about the upcoming election and some challenges that she sees with the upcoming election. And then allude to providing a transition that says Karen is amongst 70% of Americans who voted that they feel the same way. But I use Karen as a focus point to start this story off and to show her as an example of the general population. Do you all see that? So the most important part of this is the body, because it develops the central idea. The body is going to have to be so intact because it's going to be where I make the connection between that small anecdote, situation, or personal story to a general, larger issue. The success of this story, though, depends on the lead. And why would it, though? Why would the success of a focus-style news story depend on the lead? Because that example is going to be paramount to showing the reader how it's relevant to them. That small anecdote or the situation that I described in the beginning is going to be used to make a connection with the reader. And if I fail to do that, I fail to draw them into the story. So this might not be a good way to talk about a hard news story, but it's great for a feature story. It's great for a story about obesity. It's great for a story about a lot of cultural and critical issues in society, right? Not necessarily time sensitive issues like a war or a political campaign or a crash or an airplane crash, but more critical and cultural pieces um, in a society that we will read about. Yes, vaping is a great example of that. Good job. That's a great example. So it has flexibility in its arrangement. You could do this several ways, but it has four parts: the lead, the nut graft, the body, and the kicker. And the kicker brings the story to conclusion. And the kicker is meant to reiterate the personal connection again, making it relevant again. Sometimes you may use a quote. Sometimes you may use not a quote, but a statistic to do this, to bring it back personal, to make it thematic again. And then there's a narrative style. It only comprises of two components, the story and the storyteller. And I like the narrative style because it's rich in detail. It allows the reader to put themselves in that setting, immerse themselves into the story through verbs, through descriptive and rich details, but it also allows the reporter to be more creative. And this is why I love feature story writing, because you have that range. You can write it in the hourglass style. You can write it in a narrative style. But it requires the storyteller to really tune into the setting, where they are when they are writing this story or recording this event or conducting the interview. This is why the setting becomes important. If you're going to write a story about a avid huntsman, you might want to catch him in his environment. Those are some rich descriptions and the details about how he prepares for hunting. What does his hut look like? What's in his hut, right? These are details that you can include in the story to make it 10 times better. So these are the things that you're going to need, because you're going to have to be extremely specific. In order to put me into the story and to make me understand and feel the connection that you want me to feel, you're going to have to be extremely specific. So it requires observation of people, places, and important events. And the narrative style can be written either way. This is why this may not work for a hard news story, as we've already talked about. But we can write it in a chronological order. We can write it from the present and then flash back to the past. We can write it a narrative as a dialogue between two people, right? Generally, we can do all these different things because each part of the story has equal importance. So it really doesn't matter how we approach the story, just as long as we summarize the story and tell it effectively. And they are longer because we're using descriptive imagery, right? We are describing things that we hope and wish the reader will imagine. And so it's a little bit longer. Thus, it's not important. It may not be appropriate, again, for hard news stories like breaking news or government speeches. Now, finally, in our last 4 slides, we're going to talk about transitions. Why are transitions important?
Because they, they help the story move on.
Yes.
Because I can't go from talking about, like say I'm talking about LeBron, and I'm talking about how he prepared for something, but then I just flip right to the game with no transition.
Right. Your transition is going to be needed. It's needed to help you make logic, to show logic in your story. Otherwise, we won't be able to piece together what you're talking about, or this piece of information's relevance to the central idea or the main point of this story. So your transitions have to be a natural progression of thought. Like, it makes sense that he moved from here to here. Because if you don't understand it that way, your readers won't. So you have to put a story together where the parts of the story come together in a logical way for me to understand it. So as I'm reading the story, I'm logically making connections to one action to the next, one fact to the other. That stuff is important. So reporters may use key names or pronouns to do this. That's one way. But we're also going to talk about some different ways that you can do transitions. What are some other transitions that you can use? Devices. What other transitional devices can you use besides key names and pronouns? Like in the beginning, I may say, John did this, but in the next paragraph, I may say, the Mississippi native did that. I'm referring to John as the Mississippi native, right? I'm using that as a pronoun to talk about him, right? But what are other devices that we can use? Think about it. What are some other ways that you can incorporate transitions in a story? How can you move from one idea to a next? What are some ways that you can do that? And we don't think about this, but when you start thinking about it, you know what devices you can use. Time. We can go back from the past to the present and talking about LeBron James' success. In the past, he did this. Today, he's doing this. Addition, in addition to. Furthermore, moreover, causation. All of these things happen because in the past, blah, 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 blah. Comparison, contrast. You never think about those things, but those are devices that you can use to make logical connections in a story. Explaining the unfamiliar. Have you ever read a news story where you did not understand the subject? Not what they were writing, but like the subject. Like, and these are general news stories about probably economic news stories, scientific news stories. We don't know what's going on, right? Sometimes that happens because the writing is not clear. When you're dealing with topics that people don't generally, you can't expect the general audience to understand, you have to explain. But in the beginning, you don't need to start using words, grand words that make you look like you have a great vocabulary. Because as I told you previously, good news story writing isn't about showing the reader that you are a great writer. It's about the reader being able to understand that you are a writer. You are a good writer. They understand the story. You show that you are a good writer about your logic that you place into a story, not your vocabulary. So use familiar terms. And when a word is unfamiliar, define it, right? Or explain it. Instead of saying the word and defining it, explain what it is. Look at this example. She said the school will have K-6 facilities, revised. She said the school will accept children from kindergarten through 6th grade. We didn't even have to say K-6 facility, which is defined as, just go ahead and use the definition instead.
You told me once when I think I was using like BET or something, and you said put Black Entertainment Television.
And BET in parentheses. Yes, that's a great example. When using acronyms, go ahead and write it out and then use the small acronym on the second reference, especially for things that we can't expect people to know, the general audience to know what we are referencing. Then to explain several items in a list, you want to precede the list with the explanation. Look at this example. To provide children with better nutrition, better health care, and better educational opportunities were the reasons the senator voted for the bill. How would we revise that? If I need to precede the list with the explanation, how should I write that?
I would put the second sentence first. I mean, the reason the senator voted for the bill was to provide the children with better life.
Exactly. The senator voted for the bill because it would, or the reason the senator voted for the bill is because blah, blah, blah. You see where I'm going? Put that first. Explain it first and then list it. Then finally, why are examples important? What do examples do for us?
Provide like a blueprint or a similarity that we can follow.
Bingo. It provides a point of comparison and contrast. And through those examples, we're able to better understand and break down unfamiliar topics. Look at this example. You're selling your house and your real estate agent claims that he's representing your interests. but he sells the property at less than fair value to a friend who resells it at a substantial profit, on which the agent receives a kickback. You complain to the county attorney, but he gets big campaign contributions from the agent, so he pays no attention. That, in essence, is the story of the growing mutual fund scandal. That is beautiful, right? Because obviously the growing mutual fund scandal is a very complex thing, right? One that we have no clue about. But explaining it this way allows me to put myself in the situation, allows me to make logical connections to the growing mutual fund scandal and this example. I'm able to use this example as a stand-in for what the growing mutual fund scandal is. And so this is why examples are important, because they clarify unfamiliar concepts. And then finally, the need to be fair in reporting. And I know you all are like, oh my God, Jessica talks about this all the time and I'm tired of hearing it. We are not on ethics anymore. But it's so imperative that I stress to you objectivity in a news story. Why? Why am I stressing objectivity and the need to be fair in a news story? You do not want to be biased. So if you're writing about a controversial issue or an issue that has varying points of view, you want to do your best to include all of those varying perspectives. And if you can't, you probably need to ditch the story, because you do your audiences a disservice if you do not give them all sides of the story. Thus, they can't make informed decisions about how they want to feel about a topic, or make decisions about how they want to do things that govern their lives. So when a subject refuses to respond or is unavailable, it should be mentioned, or again, scratch the story altogether. That's the end.